Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to see you here today, or rather to not see you, in the sense that we only get to see the chat for now. But I'm sure that we'll have many chances to meet throughout this conference. My name is Jonas Torrens. I'm an assistant professor at the Technological University of Eindhoven, and I'm very pleased to be a part of this newcomer session. The purpose of this session is to help all of you who are new to this community or to this conference to get a soft landing. And by that, we mean get a sense of the kind of key discussions and debates that have been ongoing in this community and get an introductory feel for what those debates might look like, and have an opportunity to ask questions that might feel otherwise awkward or uncomfortable in the conference. So in this session, there are no wrong questions. This is an experience that we draw from the Sustainability Transitions conferences, and has been really fruitful in helping to invite and create a more warm welcome to all of you. We have today a very rich set of talks by Matias Ramirez, Sandra Boni, Matias Ramirez, and Shona Nienaber. Each of them will introduce themselves before their talk. And we'll talk between 5 and 7 minutes, so we get a glimpse of the different areas that we see as important to introduce you to this conference. And after that, we'll have a conversation, and please post your questions in the chat. Due to the video functionality, we're unable to see you in this stage, but we'll do our best to make sure that all your questions are addressed in this session. And if anything is not addressed now, we'll of course have the networking sessions and the other moments in this conference to just continue discussion. Without further ado, I will pass on to Matthias Weber, who will introduce us to some of the debates that have formed this community.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our conference. My name is Matias Weber. I'm based at the Austrian Institute of Technology in Vienna, and I've been working on this issue of transformative innovation policy for quite a few years. And I would like to share with you some thoughts on, how this notion of transformative innovation policy has emerged and why, and some of the key elements. I'll have 2 slides on that that I like to share with you now. So I'll try to be brief and try to pass some key ideas about transformative innovation policy with you. So just a second for sharing my slides with you. So I hope you can see them. And if not, then Jonas will send me a message, I guess. So transformative innovation policy rationales and key elements. My first question is really about why is there transformative innovation policy, or why has it been developed in the first place? What is different about it? You can address it from 2 angles. On the one hand, you can look at it more from the scientific side, from the kind of scientific concepts that have been developed. I'll try to look at it from the other angle, which is more the kind of policy angle and how this has emerged. And let's say if you think some 15 or 20 years back, innovation policy was still very much oriented towards matters of how we can best make use of innovation for purposes of economic growth and maybe also industrial development. But it was also then around the time of the mid-2000s that other, if you like, challenges to our society were emerging and becoming more prominent. Some of you may still remember the late 2000s with the financial crisis and the Arab Spring and some of the unexpected developments. Of course, we had already a kind of quite strong debate about environmental challenges and sustainability challenges at the time. And what this implied in very basic terms is that there was a growing recognition that innovation needs to be exploited and used also for other purposes than economic development. And that this required also rethinking the kind of purpose of innovation and subsequent transformation processes that depart from this notion of economic growth, because in the past we somehow had the idea that innovation is almost automatically translating into economic growth as the then, if you like, dominant ambition behind innovation. So what this raises is this question of the rediscovery of what we call now directionality of innovation and transformation. So we need to think more thoroughly about the direction in which we push change processes in society and do not take, if you like, an orientation towards economic growth for granted, but look for other issues, climate change, transformation of health systems, poverty, and other ambitions that we may want to follow. What this implied was then also that innovation needs to be understood as broader than just being focused on technology. Technology continues to matter and is important, but social and organizational dimensions of innovation are equally important if these kind of more fundamental change processes are supposed to be brought about that are associated with a transformation. It also implied that this is more than just about the diffusion of innovations, which was also the kind of more traditional take on how innovation exerts an influence in society and economy. But it also meant that a transformative system change requires changes in structures, institutions, our ways of thinking, and ultimately also our individual behavior. So this was in a way the kind of programmatic recognition that took hold in policy environments, in the European Commission, in the OECD, in international development agencies, in the global south as well, of course, with slightly different challenges than in the global north. And it implied then also that policy mixes, as we call them nowadays, so the combination of policy goals and strategies, of policy instruments, and if you like, the underpinning processes of governance need to change as well in a quite fundamental way. So the idea is that these longer term transformation processes that TIP wants to trigger and stimulate cannot be, if you like, planned and in detail in advance, but rather that you need to nurture the conditions to enable change processes to emerge and try to guide and frame them in a desirable direction. It also means that innovation policy cannot be understood just as a kind of isolated policy field, but that you need to connect much better to those policy fields that define the conditions for the subsequent uptake, scaling, and implementation of policy. So sectoral policies, for instance, where regulation and public procurement, for instance, play an important role, and that you need to bring on board a much wider range of actors and stakeholders in the definition of policies, and that need to be mobilized as well to contribute to the change processes that are to be of a transformative nature. This implies, of course, that these policy approaches, the strategies, and the use of instruments becomes more difficult. Instruments need to be seen in interaction with each other. This leads to a rather complex set of policies that are put in place as part of wider intervention strategies. And it also implies that you need to experiment and learn and test combinations of new policies in different settings, where you need anticipation also in order to guide these longer term change processes. So foresight has become a quite important element also in the context of transformative innovation policy, because we are talking here about longer term processes that are supposed to be inspired and guided by our longer term visions. And this brings me to the, if you like, items about challenges for policy implementation. Because as I said, if you are considering more a wider range of policy instruments to be to come into play in transformative policy strategies, then you can, of course, try to achieve more coherence through issues like joint vision and joint orientation. So, which is what foresight processes are very often about. of course, also against the kind of backdrop of contingencies and uncertainties of the future, but they are certainly helpful. Adaptation is very important in this context. So how do you ensure in policy that they are on the one hand, if you like, pursuing a kind of longer term transformation path, but they also need to be adapted in the course of time, and this is also pretty difficult. The third of the major challenges in this context is how to move from individual experiments, and I think Sandra is going to talk about experimentation in a minute, towards a wider uptake, scaling or replication of these experimental solutions that we are testing in specific learning environments. So this is another of the challenges that transformative innovation policy is confronted with. And of course, also the balance between trying to be directional, and one of the kind of very, if you have popular approaches currently is omission-oriented policies, which try to assume a kind of clear goal and orientation, need to be balanced with the necessary openness of transformative change processes. So ensuring this transformative character in these long-term processes quite difficult. And one of the notions that is often used here is to think of what are the kind of transformative outcomes that, for instance, public policies may create and generate. So understood as somehow the kind of stepping stones, not just for simple innovation, but really for change processes of a more fundamental nature. This is actually where I would want to stop now and give my hand over to Sandra, because she may probably pick up on some of the more specific elements, in particular the experimentation story. So I'll stop here, and I'll stop also sharing so that Sandra can take the floor.
Thanks, Matias. Yeah, I will follow you, your argument. And I'm Sandra Boni, or Alejandra Boni, working in Ingenio in Spain. I'm part of the TIPSI team since the beginning, and especially working in the formative evaluation component and other parts of the consortium. And I'm going to share my screen. Just a moment. Okay. This is the same kind of argument that Matias has shared before about the need to follow some principles and some guide when we think about experimentation in transformative innovation policy. Particularly, we in TIPSI developed these 6 principles that guide the intervention, the transformative intervention, the directionality, as Matias has referred, the importance of addressing societal goals, as those pointed out in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the impact at a level of the socio-technical system, and also very important, the relevance of fostering a kind of learning and deep learning and reflexivity in our experiments, in our engagements, to deal with conflict, and also to be inclusive and to bring on board different actors, especially the non-incumbent actors, and people and group that are working in this civil society domain. So how we do that? Well, I'm going to, because the kind of engagement in which I'm more involved are the formative evaluation that we consider as a kind of experimentation. So I'm going to refer to how we understand the formative evaluation, so how we understand this kind of experimentation, and some insights that we learn in our engagement. So for us, the formative evaluation is a way of improving, of course, an intervention, but it supports strategic development and organizational capability building. It's not an accountability tool. It takes place in real time and in close collaboration with the participant. So once the intervention is developing, we are also doing together this formative evaluation. And formative evaluation is oriented to first order, especially to second order learning, because most formative evaluation approaches seeks first order learning, but we are especially interested in deep reflexivity, in challenge our assumption, our beliefs, because this is the way also of changing the main routines that support the regime in the socio-technical system. And also in the formative evaluation, we address and analyze failure, and we are understanding failure as a way of provide learning opportunities in our experimentation, in our engagements. So what we have learned in doing this formative evaluation in different settings, in different experiments with our partners in TIPSI, we have learned that first thing, this is not a straightforward process, it's not an easy process, but we have learned that having a mutual understanding and trust building is very important, and those are really positive driver to create learning spaces that can trigger this action-based reflexivity. And to have that, we need also a safe and respectful space to talk about the process and to develop our engagement. And for us and for the participant in the engagement, that requires also to the team to remain very flexible regarding what we want to achieve. And we have to assume that the diversion to the original plan can be a source of meaningful learning and should be accepted and even embraced. And this is not easy, but we have to work in this flexibility because we are working in a very uncertain and changeable setting, a changeable context. And to do that, we have to merge techniques to achieve that. And we have to act as bricoleur of different techniques. We use the theory of change, we use the transformative outcomes and heuristic to work in this experimentation and to help this experimentation to be more transformative. But also we merge other techniques and like interviews, like learning histories, and having this capacity of merging techniques is something essential given the diversity of situation, application, and the dynamic nature of the different policy intervention. And finally, one reflection about the relevance of the attitudes and skills of the transformative innovation policy evaluators or facilitator of this kind of engagement. In evaluation, the evaluator has a traditional judgment role. In our engagement, in this formative evaluation engagement, our role is more a facilitator of a process of discovering together, not judging if the intervention is bad or it's good. No, it's more a process of discovering together, working together, and help the intervention to be more transformative. And it requires to develop and strengthen co-creation skills, including facilitation. Also, it is very important to make learning and reflexivity a core. No, it's not only a principle, it's something that should be in the process itself, and taking and being able to create the narrative through the process of adaptive learning, etc. Then attitude has humility and empathy are really relevant and necessary to build trust and mutual understanding. And finally, I think it's very important to have a real will to understand people's context and be ready to listen. So those are my insights and some reflection about how to do experimentation in our real settings. Thanks.
Okay, I think it's my turn. So my name is Matias Ramirez. I'm a senior lecturer at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. I've been involved in the TIPC consortium since the very beginning. And most of my work has been in Latin America. Initially, we had a very intense collaboration with Conciencias of Colombia. And in 2018, Conciencias, which is the national agency of science and technology, produced, in conjunction with TIPC, with people in SPRU in particular, and Ingenio and others, the Green Book, which was a national policy for the development of the Sustainable Development Goals from the perspective of science and technology. And it used the principles of transformative innovation to do that. And the effect was quite interesting, because although at a policy level, it didn't necessarily, it wasn't taken up in a top-down manner, it did encourage a whole series of academics, policymakers to begin to discuss this. And in 2020, we therefore formed a Latin America hub of transformative innovation, which includes not only people from Colombia, but also from Chile and from Mexico. And also we've created a network with people from other countries. And what I wanted to do today was just to give you an idea, what I was asked to do was just to give you an idea of the work that the hub has done. Because in so doing, we've had to begin to address what it means to undertake or begin to undertake transformative innovation policy within a global South context. And I think some of the lessons that we're beginning to learn are important. And I want to share not some of the lessons, but to describe some of the experiments with a few of the projects that we're undertaking. First of all, one of the projects is in an area of Colombia called Valle del Cauca, which is around the city of Cali. It's an area which has a lot of poverty, a lot of problems, a lot of social problems. And I just want to tell you two of the experiments. One involved the attempt to develop a peri-urban food link between some producers of an extremely fine type of cacao, which was it doesn't follow the traditional organic or permaculture sort of routines which often you see within agriculture. It was developed uniquely by the producers themselves, and therefore it's extremely fine, it's extremely good quality, but was being lost at the time because there were pressures to have a more standard type of agriculture. And what the researchers did is that they tried to establish some experiments whereby they would link this type of cacao with local producers, with some of the infrastructure of science and technology, and also some of the supermarkets in the local area. Through that process, we began to see that different types of, this was a very difficult process which existed, and different types of networks existed. There are science and technology networks. There are networks which are purely instrumental. And the experience of working with policymakers had led the producers to shun many of these networks, and it was quite difficult to actually introduce them. A second one is that the city of Cali is surrounded by this production of sugar beet. And one of the problems is that particularly when the sugar beet is burnt, it leads to large problems of atmospheric pollution, contamination, which affect the children in the main city. And this has been a problem for years. And there's been a network of people in the cities who have tried to change this, but they found enormous problems because of resistance from the companies, because of demand for data and so on to actually change this. So it's an ongoing process to try to develop and strengthen networks to try to change the way in which, or force the producers to change the way in which they produce. A third one is actually I want to talk to you about is in the city of around the University of Talca, which is in the agribusiness cluster in the south of Chile. And this was essentially about using water in a much more sustainable way for small agricultural producers. Chile is a water challenge country, is one of the most water challenged countries in the world. And it was about trying to establish networks between small producers, between people who were trying to develop alternatives, and between the civil society and between the public sector, between the policymakers. And I think what this experiment tried to show is that experimentation actually takes place in a different way in the South than in the North. In the North, sometimes there's this idea of a conductor with an orchestra who is in control conditions trying to create an experiment to show how things can happen, which can then be sort of upscaled or scaled across. And often this is much more difficult. In the case of trying to develop biocentric alternatives to water, find that the number of actors experimenting is less. That and it's very important to try to create a bit of a high degree of alignment, particularly within actors, political actors who have political clout. And that is not always easy when there's low institutionalization. On the other hand, there's a high degree of improvisation, which people are willing to undertake and carry out with very limited resources. And then finally, the case of a circular economy experiment in Bogota, in the city of Bogota. But the crucial issue here is that it's one that has to incorporate street recyclers. Many people who work, whose job it is to pick up rubbish, disposal rubbish, and to make some money out of it. People often of the lowest, if you like, income strata who have migrated because of different reasons to the city. And in any concept of circular economy, you have to take those groups of people into account. And this is very much about, on the one hand, changing expectations of people who live in the city in terms of how they treat these street recyclers, to treat them as part of the process by which you can dispose of solid rubbish in a more sustainable way, and also ensuring a better economic return, formalization, etc. for these street recyclers. And what this tells us sometimes is that experimentation is very much sometimes in the South, it can be, people are constantly experimenting because it's a day-to-day struggle for existence. Experimentation becomes a day-to-day activity in which you have to work in the context of informality, of sort of half rules. And this is something that you have to work with all the time. And it's very, very important from the point of view of redefining the way experimentation happens. So some of the conclusions that we're drawing is that often the work of transformative innovation, the way policy has to interact with transformation is in the context of social movements, is in the context of conflict, which is sometimes in evidence or sometimes is just under the surface. It's one in which there's a lot of fluidity, a lot of informality, but also an enormous ability of actors to improvise. Also where universities play a very, very big role, because academics have a certain respect, have a certain authority, and it's a space in which one can do things. So all these things you need to work with, above all, to try to ensure that processes are participative and that there is, as Sandra was just saying, there is a process of learning. That's probably the most important thing. Many times experiments take place and there isn't a sense of learning that takes place, rather a sense of frustration in projects. But what you really want is to change that so that people actually learn from that process. And just a final thing, we're going to be discussing some of these in the session on Tuesday, that's tomorrow at 3:45, session 6, where we'll go into more detail on some of the experiments. So that gives you a flavour of the sort of work we're doing. And thank you very much for listening.
Hello, everybody. This is Shanna here, and it's really great to be with you this afternoon. Before I start sharing my thoughts, I'd like to just thank the audience that is starting to ask us questions. I think for me, the whole purpose of this session is to start that process of engaging with what sometimes sounds like a very articulate set of ideas. And I think what I wanted to share from my side as a practitioner who started feeling quite overwhelmed in the beginning is that there's no question that is too big or too small here. I think the idea is just to start questioning somewhere, and from your experience. So thank you for those that are starting to engage, and please keep the questions coming. We'll try and speak to some of them after my comments. So I'd like to try and share 3 groups of thoughts with you. The first thing I'd like to do is just introduce myself as a practitioner, and how I connect with TIPSI in that way. The second thing I'd like to do is share just some of my thoughts about what TIPSI means in terms of an expanded role for innovation project managers and funding agencies going forward. And maybe if there's time, some expectations for funding for institutions that fund research and innovation in different ways going forward. So starting with me, I work at an organization called the Water Research Commission in South Africa. And in simple terms, we're a research and innovation funding agency. But over our operations over the last 50 years as an institution, we've grown in our mandate and our space in terms of our ability to convene a wide and diverse range of stakeholders in the water and innovation sectors. We're advise on water-related policy and industry issues. We're able to work with a range of partners to address water security threats and challenges, so trying to see innovation through to its kind of logical endpoint in terms of implementation. My specific role in the organization is to support the sector to implement the National Research Development and Innovation Roadmap, which is really our 10-year plan and aspiration around water research investment for the country. And one of the projects within this wide roadmap is a project called the Living Catchments project. And that is, I think, the smallest connection point and closest connection point I can articulate with the TIPSI journey. The Living Catchments project is a project that is focused on learning, and learning amongst a wide range of researchers, policymakers, and innovators that through that learning allows us to try to improve the policy, institutional, and investment arrangements for the intersection between built infrastructure, dams, pipes, etc., and the upstream landscape that supplies the water. So it's a grey-green nexus kind of intervention that we're looking at. And in 2020, we undertook an intensive 4-month process that allowed us to more deeply articulate a theory of change for this project. And we did that working with the global TIPSI and the South African TIPSI community of practice. And it was both a training and a co-learning journey that we went on to try to connect the TIPSI concepts with our Living Catchments project in South Africa. And in so doing, try to deepen the transformative outcome that this project would have in our sector. So that's a whole big mouthful. And the reason I wanted to spend a little bit of time trying to articulate what I do and how I've connected with TIPSI is because as a practitioner and a person who works in water policy issues, I believe that it's really important to understand that your organization, in my case, the Water Research Commission, and your policy context, in my case, the National Research Development and Innovation Roadmap, is a key part of the transformative change that you are trying to drive with the project that you are managing, right? Or the project that you are trying to connect with a TIPSI set of ideas. And this is a big shift, I think, from a traditional project management approach for research funding organizations, because it acknowledges that you're not separate from this project. You're not neutral in the project implementation process. You are part of that transformation that you're trying to drive. And in our case, the Water Research Commission is allowing us access to multiple ministries, input on policy writing processes that are at the grey-green nexus interface, allowing us to advise on different evidence-based changes that should be made in policy, and that all comes through our role that we play as project manager. So I think that's a first consideration, sort of almost understand yourself in the process that you're trying to engage around transformation. The second thing is that through my work with TIPSI, I've realized that as a project manager in an innovation funding agency, there's a departure in a transformative project from how we would usually work in these spaces. And if I had to put in simplest terms how we would usually work, the kinds of models that I've seen as most typical around the world and in South Africa is that you either have a funding agency where you have a manager who's essentially a generalist, managing a wide range of diverse projects across a whole range of fields and disciplines, and then you're ultimately managing the administrative process and the funding process behind that. Alternatively, which is the model we implement at the WRC, you have a specialist, for example, a specialist in wastewater treatment that manages a portfolio of specialist wastewater treatment projects, and you manage the depth science behind those projects and the quality of the science. But that kind of more transversal role that the TIPSI process is calling us to is maybe a stretch in terms of what we normally do. So what I have found through my experience of just this Living Catchments project as an example is that firstly, as the project manager, you've got to really deeply internalize the TIPSI concepts yourself. Because the thing that is most powerful is not the language or the name of the outcome or any of these things. It's actually the question that it asks you about your project, the question that leads you to deeply ask yourself what kind of transformative change you're driving. And to ask those questions, you have to understand the concepts. So I think that's the first thing, internalize the concepts. The second thing that the project manager, someone like myself, has to do is do a fair amount of buffering and translating between the academics that have driven the development of the TIPSI concepts and are able to articulate the kind of change that we're trying to drive through TIPSI, and the practitioners that are implementing on the ground who are not necessarily at ease with the kind of academic language that this kind of work is espoused in. And so you play a really big buffering role in terms of translating, buffering, and finding language that works in your context to get you where you're trying to go. The third thing I found is that it's ultimately your project team. And in the case of my Living Catchments project, it's a team of practitioners and policymakers that I'm funding. It's that team that have to write their theory of change, that have to write their monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework. This is different to how teams like the Living Catchments teams would usually do this, where they would appoint an external consultant very often to do this kind of work. But really, to go through the depth of this, you need that team to write that theory of change using the TIPSI transformative outcomes as a basis. And that is not a skill set that practitioners typically draw on in our context. And so there's a whole role that you play as the project manager in helping to develop a framework for reporting, for writing a theory of change that allows the team to connect with these concepts and document their story. Other small things, you've got to manage people who are going through a process of being asked uncomfortable questions. And so that's a people management process that is time consuming and in some ways quite draining. You also have to be able to straddle two parallel universes. On the one hand, as a project manager, you have to maintain expectations of your funder or your principals, which is around managing risk, delivering on project spec, a more traditional understanding of monitoring and evaluation that allows you to tick certain boxes, that shows funders that they have kind of got what they expected for their money. Whilst on the other hand, we know that transformation is an emergent process. And so this requires a flexibility in how we manage projects and needs to allow for a certain amount of change and evolution within a project. And so as a project manager, you have to kind of dance the dance between those two worlds at all times to achieve optimal outcomes. You need a strong ability to convene people and keep them connected with this process of developing your transformative change, and a lot of time to do this. I'm aware that my time is almost up, but the last sort of thing I wanted to share, which is brief, is that, I've spoken about the role of the project manager, him or herself, but I think there's also a set of questions that funding institutions more broadly have to ask themselves in terms of how to connect with transformative project management and funding going forward. And then this is some very preliminary thoughts, but the first thing is that as investment institutions, we have to have a very clear sense of the portfolio of projects we're investing in. Which of the projects in this portfolio are the transformative projects and which ones are not? Because not everything has to go through the same level of rigor that a transformative innovation project would have to go through. The second thing is that you need to be able to transition projects into a transformative mold if you see that the outcomes are heading in that direction, which requires a flexibility in terms of the contractual and project management models that we have in our institutions. And that's not always easy for us. And so it's something we need to look at. Ultimately, I have the sense that projects that we want to truly manage as big transformation interventions in the system require a unique set of investment approaches, project management templates, etc. And so we need to develop those systems within our institutions to manage this specially. Particularly, these projects need a slow startup phase so that we can take the time to develop strong theories of change that are well consulted with the right stakeholders. But that actually needs funding and upfront lead time before implementation starts to get right. And that's not typically how we fund. We fund and expect projects to get moving very fast often. And it's something for us to consider in the innovation space. This works better in the infrastructure space, where there's an understanding that good projects take time to develop. But in the research and innovation space, we don't often have the same lead times. And it's something we can perhaps learn from the infrastructure sector there. Thirdly, there's going to need to be investment in skills or mentorship of managers to manage these kinds of projects, because it is a different, more uncomfortable space to be in as project managers in light of kind of what I've highlighted before. And so it's something to think about there. And maybe finally, that our review criteria, our articulating of research and innovation calls, our templates that go with that, are going to need to be put together in a way that allows us to identify and appropriately fund these kinds of transformative projects. And so it does require a level of changed organizational approach that is really important. It's the start of the conversation, but I hope it's some ideas to start the conversation. And thank you for the time. Over to you.
We'll have all the panelists coming back. Thank you, Shauna. This was really useful and very illustrative of the kind of practical ways of going about this. And thank you so much for your reflections. We have a series of questions already in the chat, but I would ask for those of you that are watching from home to continue posting. To kickstart, I would ask Johan Schot to speak to the definition of how transformation, how transformation is understood in the innovation context, and in particular, if you could also differentiate from how transformations, for example, have been discussed by Carl Polanyi, following the questions from Anne and Klaus in the chat.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for asking these questions. If you use the word transformation, you have, of course, to ask the question, transformation of what? And what we do in TIPSI, but I think more broadly, drawing on the sustainability transitions literature, is to say change of socio-technical systems or of socio-ecological systems. That basically means that we look at a set of relationships, because a system consists of as a technological part, but also there are policies connected to it, user preferences, industry strategies. So we need to change all of these elements. And therefore it's often not enough to just change the technology, you also need social innovation, and they need to be coupled. But we can also go a bit deeper, because systems are built by actors, and in my view, I think this is more broadly shared, actors are driven by what we call rules, so routines, and these routines are collective and are embedded in the system and are driven by values and beliefs. So in the end, transformation is about a change of value and beliefs, and putting in place new rules that then actors will draw on in order to rebuild systems. Well, the bigger question about Polanyi, because a lot of the research is about single systems, change of the mobility system, the water system, but in the end we need to redirect the economy, and we need to redirect society. In fact, we need to redirect the entire industrial society built since deep in the 19th century. Polanyi was already calling for this. He was talking about re-embedding the market in society. So according to his view, the market had become too dominant and needed to become controlled to some extent by the market. You could argue that the sustainability revolution is also about re-embedding in society, but also about re-embedding in nature. So that is the similarity. It's about re-embedding, but it's a much broader agenda than Polanyi, and it's about rebuilding industrial modernity, while his project was about improving industrial modernity by re-embedding in society. But now we have a much bigger challenge.
Thank you, Johan. If there are follow-up questions, please post them in the chat. I will move on to Matthias Weber, and I'll ask him to address the question from Caleb and Suzanne on the links between transformative innovation policy and classic innovation policy.
Yes, thank you for the nice question. Maybe let me first take a step back what characterizes a more traditional classical innovation policy approach. I think you can say that one can distinguish on the one hand structural innovation policy aiming to, if you like, provide appropriate conditions for innovation activities across the board to emerge and to be nurtured independently of any thematic agenda. In addition, you have in traditional innovation policy, of course, thematic agendas that are often taking specific technology fields as their starting point, sometimes certain domains like energy or transport, but with a tendency often of, again, using research and innovation, even broadly understood, as the starting point. So it's a question of what you take as the starting point. That is one of the important distinctions between classical innovation policy and transformative innovation policy. Because in transformative innovation policy, you would rather look from the problem or challenge side at the issue. And that may also entail maybe looking for other than research and innovation driven solutions, which could, for instance, be also social ones. This does not necessarily exclude the two to be combined, but if you like, traditionally, the emphasis on research and technology funding has been the kind of main pillar of this thematic arm of innovation policy. And of course, this brings then this up the issue of what roles you assign to different forms of innovation in, for instance, the funding programs or the funding portfolios of an R&I agency. There is a second important distinction, namely regarding the issue of how early on you connect the research and innovation policy agendas of the classical type with the more sectoral, downstream, and transformative conditions that are provided by sectoral policies, for instance. So the traditional or classical take was that innovation policy or research innovation policy has been a quite distinct policy area of its own. And from a kind of transformative innovation policy perspective, we try to connect earlier on already the kind of sectoral agendas that are dealing with regulatory issues, for instance, with the research and innovation funding elements, in order to have a kind of much tighter entanglement of the two. And let's say the third element that I think differs is the range of actors that you consider relevant for innovation. So from a classical innovation policy perspective, if you like, you usually have industry research organizations, maybe some users involved, but you would not necessarily take on board also citizens, cities, and other stakeholders that may be affected by the policies, by the technological innovations. And this is, if you like, kind of third element that, with regard to which transformative innovation policy differs from classical innovation policy. Now, as regards this question of the difference between transformative innovation policy and mission-oriented policy, I would tend to argue that mission-oriented policy or innovation policy is a very specific kind of transformative innovation policy. So missions, transformative missions, may pursue a similar ambition sometimes like transformative innovation policy, but the approach is very different in terms of assuming that you can very clearly define the target or the agenda that defines the mission. Now, when we are dealing with areas where we are confronted with a lot of uncertainty, defining that target is almost impossible. We do not know often what that kind of target looks like. We need to foresee much more space for learning and a kind of much more open approach to exploring and discovering new solutions that we do not know about yet. And I think this is also a very important distinction in the sense that mission orientation assumes a level of planability that is not necessarily given. And in many instances and in many socio-technical systems, as Johan referred to before, this kind of planability is not given, and you therefore need to recur to other approaches that are more open, more exploratory, more learning-based, more experimental, in line with what we would call the philosophy of transformative innovation policy.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful. Sandra, I was wondering if you could perhaps share with us an example of a theory of change, following from one of the questions we had earlier.
Yeah, with pleasure. Can you see it on my screen? Yeah. Yes. Can you see it, Jonas? Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, this is the final product, no? But as Shana said, the process is really important. So to get to this point of this image of a theory of change, you have to interact in many ways, putting question, reflecting, so enacting this process of learning and reflexivity. And here is one example. You have in the chat, you have many other examples, but this is one example of an interaction between TIPSI and ClimateKick in the Motion project. In one of the projects in this motion is the adaptive cities through integrating nature-based solution. And here you can see different outcomes in some point, and the link between the outcome, the output, and the activities. And in the different color correspond to different transformation pathways that are inspired by different transformative outcomes. We don't have time to explain the transformative outcomes, but those 12 outcomes, they came from the transformative innovation policy literature are an engagement. So these 12 outcomes are a guide, no, to make the intervention or to help the intervention to be more transformative, no, in this way of addressing these big societal challenges, this directionality, etc. So in this theory of change, you can see how the networking and learning pathway is inspired by some of these outcomes, and produce some inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And also you have two pathways of transformation inspired by the circulation or replication pathway. And finally, you have one pathway of transformation inspired by the upscaling and institutional pathways. So those are the influence. Those pathways are influenced by the transformative outcomes. You have many other examples in the chat, but this is a way of showing you the final product of a theory of change engagement. But as Shana said, the process is much more relevant than the product. So the interaction, the learning, all that happened in developing this theory of change is much more relevant in my view.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We have a flurry of questions now, so let's see if we can address them. The first one that I would ask Matias Ramirez to address is this question of the potential link and sort of engagement with, dialogue and learning between TIPSI network and practitioners and the Globalex network and its regional chapters. Do you see any important similarities or differences in how the transformative innovation policy and innovation systems approaches operate?
Yes, I think there's enormous potential for these to work together. After all, many of us are people who are interested in science, technology, innovation policy. And it's important that we talk about that. Now I think that the Globalex is a network which is developed around ideas of principally systems of innovation, but it's actually within the systems of innovation, there are, of course, different approaches, Lundvall and Nelson, and there's been written about how systems are established in the South. The work of Judith Sutz is very important here to understand the vast differences in the way you understand systems. And I think that transformations does require, is essentially about systems thinking. So I think there are a lot of overlaps, and certainly I think AfriELIX and the Africa Network, chapter of GlobalELIX and TIPC work very, very closely, and it's good. I think it's very, very positive. There are, of course, differences, and Johan and Ed Steinmuller in the paper in Research Policy talked about these frames, the first, second, and third frame, where the second frame was about systems of innovation, and the third frame was about transformative innovation. So it's important to understand that there are differences, and they're the ones that I think the other Matias Weber talked about just now. Much more emphasis on issues such as directionality. But I think, and I would hope, that this is part of a debate within a community of people working on innovation. I think transformation adds a narrative to the traditional systems of innovation approach, and therefore it reinforces it. It's a narrative which is about directionality. It permits a narrative. It permits more easily to introduce things like inclusion, which is something which the original founders of the ideas of innovation, such as Christopher Freeman and Åke Lundvall, actually emphasized a lot. But in the policy-making sphere, sometimes that is lost. It becomes a rather technocratic approach. So I think this can help. This can help to take that literature forward. But I would hope that as is already taking the place, that both approaches would work together, as I think there have been in the conferences and so on. There's constant discussion taking place. So yeah, I think we should continue to deepen our links.
Thank you so much, Matias. There are many questions in the chat, and there is one in particular that has received some upvotes. And that question is the question of defining, trying to summarize what TIP represents for you in one sentence, or even more succinctly in one word. So I would like to end the session doing a round of the panelists and trying to address this question. And before that, I would like to thank the chat for the participation as we're ending very shortly. And to say that this is just the beginning of a much broader conversation we'll be having this whole week. So thank you so much. And Shana, over to you.
Victoria, that is an impossible question, just for the record, but I'm going to take a try. So if I had to put this into one sentence, I would say this is a set of projects, actions, a portfolio that unlocks systemic change, that shifts us towards a world where we realize the aspiration of the SDGs. And if I could add a second sentence, that from a practitioner point of view, these projects when you see them. It's intuitive. You can feel it as soon as you see them, right? So it's not something to get caught up in definitions about. So I think it's more around how do you move on these things when you see them. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandra, would you like to give it a shot?
I think Shana's definition is excellent. I will add the process should be reflexive and trigger learning, which I think is a very essential ingredient of this transformation.
Matias Ramirez, any additions?
Maybe harnessing the talent and the imagination of local actors with technology and with innovation to try to build new futures which are social and environmentally sustainable.
Pretty nice. I'm surprised how well this is going. Matias Weber, any
Yeah,
sentence, one word.
I've been thinking about it because I saw the question on the chat. But before I answer, I would still like to make some publicity for the networking sessions afterwards, where I would actually like to address the question of combinations of classical and transformative innovation policy. So if anybody is interested in Susanne's question, I would like to address it there. Now to the question. Well, for me, transformative innovation policy in a way is the attempt to exploit the potential of the full scope of innovation opportunities, so including all kinds of innovation, and that picks up on Shanna's definition, for unlocking ourselves from, if you like, unsustainable and moving towards more sustainable societal development pathways. So it has this idea of, well, there is a need to unlock ourselves from path dependencies and redirecting the societal development in a more sustainable direction, or however you want to define the desirable pathways.
Thank you. And Johan, final attempt.
Okay, well, science, technology, innovation policy in the past has been called upon to correct market failures and to correct innovation system failures. With transformative innovation policy, they have to correct what Matthias Weber in one of his earlier publications called transformational failures. So a lot of government policies, in fact, reinforce the status quo instead of enacting system change. And that's the rationale behind government policy for me, overcoming transformational failure.
That's more than one sentence, Johan.
It's one sentence, many commas.
We'll have to see the transcript to confirm it. But thank you so much, everyone, to all the panelists and to everyone that participated. I look forward to seeing you all throughout the conference. So yeah, please join the networking sessions, which is a great moment to explore some of these questions more in depth.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.